creatures at the door. Give it all you got, no hesitating. You've been waiting all your life. This is your moment. This is your moment. Than it's ever been, and now it's more than just a win. It's where your life begins. Yeah, there's no holding back, no overthinking. You've been reaching all your life. This is your moment. This is your moment.
And we're live! Hello everyone and welcome to Samanthropolitics, a show where we talk about global politics and women's rights. We have a great show coming up for you. We have some incredible women in the San Francisco area that are planning a really amazing conference and are experts in the impact investing space. So we're going to talk about impact investing, we're going to talk about stakeholder capitalism and why that could be one of the solutions to increase equity in America. But first, I want to start by talking about the disturbing news that we had that a group of men were plotting to kidnap Gretchen Whitmer, the governor of Michigan. I hope that everyone finds this unbelievably disturbing. There were 19 felony charges filed against 7 individuals and 13 arrested. Let's take a look at these gentlemen and see what they look like. So, in case you're wondering, if there's something that you're looking that's in common about all of them, yes, they're all white men. And you can see they're of all ages. So, I think it's really important to think about the fact that they're all men because most of the people that are involved in extremism, and especially the ones who are involved in violent extremism, are men. So there's something about masculinity here. And there's an expert named Michael Kimmel, and he talks about how, extremism to these men is a way to kind of take back their masculinity. It's a way to kind of, restore their rights of some grievance they have because they feel like they were entitled to more and that someone took it away from them. They kind of have this ethos of come join your brothers, join your comrades. Like we have this mission to preserve the white race. And then there's also another element which another author, J.M. Berger, talks about. And he talks about how during periods of uncertainty, so if we think about this within the framework of COVID, during periods of uncertainty, that people are really drawn to groups with a clear and defined identity because they want to feel like they're part of something. They want to have certainty in their life. So you also see that these men somehow felt as if they were aggrieved against by Whitmer, by the system, which is evidenced by the fact that they also not only wanted to kidnap her, they wanted to instigate a civil war and were engaged in planning and training to attack the Michigan Capitol building and kidnap government officials. Like, the other thing that I just think is so interesting is like they created this fantasy narrative of how they are going to be the heroes of the white race because they are going to instigate a civil war, probably to get rid of minorities and people of color, or underrepresented minorities, and they want to attack government officials, but there's also this element of really getting rid of the outgroup, and that this perceived outgroup, is responsible for all of the suffering that they have in life. If you look at Nazi Germany, you look at how the Germans were able to get kind of whipped up by Hitler and his cadre to say, hey, you know who's responsible for your suffering? It's not you. It's the Jews, obviously. And how convenient to be able to scapegoat someone and not be able to take personal responsibility. So I think the gendered aspect is really clear here. Especially there was one of the FBI informants said that Fox described it as a snatch and grab man. Grab the effing governor. Just grab the bitch. And so just the language of that, you can tell that they're so angry that this woman is the governor. I know a woman, the governor, is wild. And that she has way more power than these men who are running amok with Confederate flags, firing rounds into their backyards and their neighbors' houses. This is also like the super disturbing part. In what country in the world do you wake up and your neighbor has a bunch of like militiamen in his backyard and they're all firing rounds everywhere? Like, does anyone find that like extremely disturbing? I think I would die. Only in America is that like, oh, this is normal. Like it's like guys' book club. They just do firearms training and combat drills on Wednesday nights. Like that's not normal, and we should not be living in a country where that is the male version of book club. It's just wild. So a couple other things I wanted to talk about in terms of so why do people get attracted to these extremist groups? So they have this belief that the survival of them as the in-group can't be separated from the need to be hostile against that out-group. So basically, their success is preconditioned on getting rid of the out-group. They also have very prescribed notions of what makes people the in-group and what makes people the out-group. And the other thing is then they come up with this, it's called a crisis solution construct, according to J.M. Berger, where they basically say that this crisis that's affecting the in-group, so in this case it could be unemployment due to COVID, has been caused by this out-group. And the only way to resolve that crisis is by taking hostile action against that out-group. So you can see, in this paradigm of the Michigan guys, it's like, okay, we created this in-group of whatever their ridiculous name was, the Wolverines. And okay, our outgroup is Whitmer and, the Democrats and the liberals. And we need to take action against them because they are the reason for our suffering. They also clearly have like an overwhelming amount of grievance, which I think is also really important. This is also really essential. So one of the narratives of these groups are conspiracy theories, and we've seen how QAnon has led people to walk into a pizza shop in DC that doesn't have a basement with a firearm and demand to go down to the basement where there's human trafficking happening when there's not even a basement. Right, that was a QAnon conspiracy, but this man genuinely believed, again, this fictional narrative, this fantasy story, just like these men, where he's the hero and he's going in to save children from human trafficking. But it was all made up. It was all nonsense. So that's a conspiracy theory. And, you'll see the QAnon conspiracy theories, they build upon each other. And the way it's so interesting, like the QAnon people, it's like they will find, a number in the background of a photo and say, oh, that number actually means 3 minutes until the attack of this, or 3 minutes until blah blah. They just make stuff up, but they create these narratives that become really believable. And then when people get involved in QAnon, they go down this rabbit hole of really starting to believe this because these people have designed all this evidence to support it. Conspiracy theories are cumulative. It's one builds on the next, and people who believe one conspiracy theory are more apt to believe more. And then you add social media to the mix, which is full of disinformation, where you can basically find anything that will confirm your own opinion. So it's very convenient, and then you have the silo of how information in your newsfeed is according to what you already think. And you've also defriended anyone who doesn't share your political views, so you're not seeing anything that they think. So one thing in conspiracy theories that's really interesting that I thought is really important for this is that they believe that the in-group, which is in this case the Wolverines, I hope that's the right name, is full of merit but lacks agency. So they are, they've got character, they have a mission, like their belief is really true, their grievances are based in fact, but they're lacking in agency. So they can't do anything about that. Whereas the out group, so in this case, Whitmer, the Democrats, lack merit, but they possess agency. So in that case, they're like, oh, well, this woman, this woman who's running our state, she has no merit. She has no character. She has no ethics, which of course was aggrandized by Trump saying liberate Michigan and excoriating her at any chance that he got. But she has so much agency. Why does she have so much agency when she has no merit? And yet we have no agency and we have so much merit. So that's a really fundamental aspect of conspiracy theories that's really important to understand. So before we go to our guests, I just want to say next week we're actually going to have Gary Barker on the show, who's the CEO of Promundo Global, and he's going to be with us specifically to talk about masculinity and extremist ideology and how do we create healthier versions of masculinity that don't include deciding to kidnap the governor of Michigan. Yeah, I just can't. So I'm going to bring in our guests, and then we're going to have a little talk about the vice presidential debate before we dive into the next topics. So I am going to just introduce our two incoming guests. So we have the lovely Kate Byrne. So Kate Byrne is the president of Intentional Media and SOCAP Global. So this is a purpose-driven platform. Kate just rocks. And she's managed to put all of these things together that all have similar themes. So social capital markets, spectrum, total impact, and conscious company media. And it's really about redefining what business means and trying to embed business with value and meaning and human centeredness, not just about money and profit and revenue. Prior to joining the company in February of 2019, Byrne held leadership roles at Watermark, which is a women's organization, the Tides Foundation, the George Lucas Education Foundation, Future LLC, Business Week, Fast Company, and San Francisco Chronicle and Inc. Byrne is passionate about education and women's empowerment, having led efforts at Global Girl Media and World Pulse, as well as founding Girls Gone Global, which is a social enterprise charged with igniting female voices, social impact, media, and financial literacy skills. Now, Byrne was also named to the prestigious Folio 40, being recognized as one of the 40 most influential top media industry performers. A frequent speaker at industry events, her opinion columns on changing corporate culture have been published in Market Watch, and she's also the president of the board of the U.S. National Committee for UN Women in San Francisco. And then we have Carrie. So Carrie is vice president of SOCAP, which is the conference that we're going to talk about. She, for the past 15 years, Carrie has been the principal at OrgDot, a strategic systems development and design experiences consultancy she founded to work with startups, social enterprises, and the impact investing community. Her work is rooted in systems thinking, sustainability, human-centered design, education, and relationship building, and has consistently focused on bringing people together to strengthen initiatives and build connections that produce impact. She lives in San Francisco Bay with her husband and her daughter and dogs, and she loves to paddleboard. All right, ladies, welcome.
Hello.
As what her Guilfoyle says, the best is yet to come. So I want to thank you so much for being here with me today. How's everyone doing?
Great, thanks.
Fantastic. So before we dive into the million things that both of you do and the amazing ways that you're changing the world, I'd love to just talk about the vice presidential debate. So we saw for the first time an African American woman on the stage, and we also saw plexiglass separating the vice presidential candidates because the president was diagnosed with COVID a day after the presidential debate when he was spitting at Joe Biden for 2 hours. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on, you've both really been involved in empowering women and girls. What was it like to see an African American woman take the stage with such presence and charisma?
I thought it was thrilling. It was moving. It was poignant. It was extremely powerful. And I just kept thinking of all the different people that were being impacted by witnessing that moment. Because we all know that sometimes sadly, we need to see it to believe it. And now we've seen it and it can happen. So I thought it was terrific. Well, we'll get into that a little bit later. So Care, what did you think?
I agree with all of that. The other thing I would say is similar, kind of building on top of the idea of seeing, but representation is so important.
Yeah.
And so I'm thinking of all of the young women and African American women across the country who have not had representation like that at that level.
Right.
And that it is those changing narratives that she started changing narratives in a completely different way for an entire community during that debate.
And what struck me, I loved her presence. And you've got to know, swallowing a lot of what I'm sure she really wanted to say.
Yeah.
And knowing that she was not, especially because she was a woman, doubling down because she's a woman of color. That took such restraint, and yet she was extraordinarily powerful at the same time. I was so proud of her and the way she just made her points, and there was just no doubt about where she stood. I thought she was terrific.
And she was so, it was so amazing, the antidote to the presidential debate, where it was,
yes,
I mean, it was mostly Trump yelling and interrupting and Joe Biden rolling his eyes. But she is just so, like, Trump gets upset at anything. It's like, oh, sorry. Like, I keep thinking about, like, if he does do a virtual debate and they have the ability to actually mute him, I feel like he might actually have a heart attack on the stage. Because he's never used to anyone shutting him up.
So the thing that I thought was also really interesting was, I believe that conversation that we witnessed on Tuesday night really also opened the eyes of a lot of men. I mean, and men often think, oh, yes, I understand. I've seen it. I've heard it. But I've got to tell you that my husband was just going on and on. And he's, unfortunately, I've gone through it. I know all of us have gone through this in one shape or form, but John was just saying, it's despicable. It's terrible. It's terrible that she also can't, she kind of had to mute a little bit, but she couldn't come forth with all the passion that she had. And so I think that there's, on that level too, I'm thinking it can potentially be helpful in opening eyes and moving conversations and shifting, hopefully, behaviors internally in many organizations, and frankly, let's face it, households too.
Yeah. Like, one thing I always say when I do gender equity trainings is that when men get angry, it's called passionate, and when women get angry, it's called too emotional or crazy.
Yeah.
Right.
It's so true. And I was just thinking about your earlier comments regarding Michigan. I'm a psych major, and it just makes you go. My psych major in me comes alive. And, you sit there and you think about, wow, it's kind of like G.I. Joe time, not to date myself, but it's just, and I think the fact that people are so, I'm going to say, wounded and angry and hurt and everything and confused and scared and nothing looks the same, but to have that level of need to be a victim or right. There's such positionality, and there's such a either or versus a both and. It just, it's extraordinary to me that in this day, well, on a lot of levels, unfortunately, and we'll get into this a little bit later when we talk about racial equity, I'm sure, but there's just a lot that still exists that's just shocking.
Right. And I wonder if we are ever going to have, like, if you look at Donald Trump, he has done absolutely nothing to unite us. Like, at every moment where he could have come out and been like, we are I heard the words "the American people" more in the vice presidential debate than I heard in 4 years of Donald Trump, because he doesn't talk about the American people. He talks about the
He doesn't
liberals
care
and
about them.
the failing media, the failing New York Times, and like he literally, and his base, like he doesn't talk to people like you and me just because we're Democrats. He's not
Right.
my president. Like I literally don't feel like he's my president.
Well, and I was also very struck by the fact that there were actual sentences being spoken during the debate.
What a bar! What a high bar we have.
It's true. It's true. So that, and that I think Trump, but then more specifically, Harris and Biden are ready to start moving toward uniting. And I think that is just an antidote that we need right now, desperately and deeply. So I'm hopeful that is something that came through pretty loud and clear during the debate for others as well.
And one thing to build on that, one thing that I was really hopeful by was, and it's something that, we've all sort of talked about this a little bit before in various conversations we've had but women really need to start standing up for each other.
Yeah,
that's
absolutely.
right.
Yeah.
So we can sit there and point the fingers at men, but I was heartened to see that 68% of the women or whatever it was actually were in favor of Kamala. And even that 48, even though it wasn't as much as we'd like to have seen from the men, still it was 48%. There was a day when that would have been 28%. And let's face it, there was a time when women would have also somehow, for whatever reason, found issue. And so I was heartened to see that there was a bit more support for each other on that level, because I think that's what's also going to really, really help us move and activate, and as you said, advocate for those who don't necessarily have a seat at the table.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, when I was on Hillary's campaign, it was just amazing the number of people I spoke to who were like, "Oh, I just don't like her. I can't put my finger on it, but I just don't like her." I'm like, "Is it because she has a vagina? Like, like literally, like, is she have the wrong anatomy down there? Like, what is it?" It just boggled my mind.
So there's a really interesting book called that I just was interviewing Elizabeth Lesser about, and it was her book, Cassandra Speaks. And it's essentially, the premise is, what would happen if all of the world's stories, be it myths, the Bible, everything, was spoken through a woman's voice? And one of the key pieces was this women in power. And that's what happened. The story of Cassandra, she had the power of seeing the future, but she was also cursed. People were never going to believe her. And so but that's an extraordinary power. So I think the world is getting used to slowly having women be in power. Hopefully not as much as we need it to be. Get ready, world. We're coming.
Yeah. And I wonder,
as Kamala would say, we're coming after you.
I love that. They're coming after you. And I wonder too, how much it would be really interesting to see, like people's opinions before all the press about like the women-led COVID countries doing really well, and then after that, like, did that actually have an impact? That was pretty widely put out. They're like, hey, New Zealand, they had another tiny outbreak, they're fine again. Germany, done really well. Finland, done great. Like, all of these female-led countries have really outperformed the male-led countries, and so I wonder if people are actually hearing that, because it's not like, the thing about COVID is it's happening to all of us. It's not like, oh, this female-led country is doing really well when it comes to, their economy, or like something that's like apart from us, but because it's something that we're all experiencing at the same time, you can also do that cross comparison and be able to see that. So
yeah,
it'll be fascinating. Hopefully we'll have some takeaways.
Yeah, I think that's one of the, if you have to make it's one of the things about COVID that I think will prove helpful is exactly that. It's been undiscriminatory. Everybody's in the same place. And as a result, it's really taking each of our systems down to the studs, or certainly giving it a good shake to find out where the cracks are, and recognizing, wow, a lot of these things, and we often talk about this as a team, this whole notion of, well, when we get back to normal. Well, normal wasn't great for most of the
Yeah,
world.
that's
So
so true.
I think everyone needs to take a step back and really, truly reimagine bit by bit how we can how we can rebuild and adjust.
And that COVID has, Kate, as you were saying, it is really illuminated where we have significant inequities, and the fact that it has laid bare systemic racism. It has demonstrated the many layers of where we have injustice, and the fact that it has disproportionately affected Black, Brown, Indigenous communities of color. Those are all things that, in addition to just the fact that it's affecting everyone, it is disproportionately affecting others in specific communities. And that's something I think we really need to take a look into right now, but then as we continue to go in the effects of the communities themselves, but then how we can start to create some solutions that will really address those inequities.
Right. From a systemic standpoint, as opposed to just a mere lipstick on a pig kind of, that looks okay. Right. A cover up kind of blemish.
And it's, agreed. I mean, and it's exposed so many flaws in our system. It's exposed the flaws in our healthcare system. It's also, I think it's just been huge in terms of exposing our caretaking. You know, this issue that we have with lack of childcare in our country is unbelievable. And how many women are, I was on a Zoom call with a woman the other day who's a single mom. I thought she was going to pull her hair out. She's like, well, I have to, make sure Zach's homework is ready, and then Susie's homework, and then Sarah's homework. And I was just like, I'm never having children. I was like,
no, it's a real
it's
thing.
Tough. Yeah. And our elder care. So in the in both directions, we are failing systemically.
Right, and not everyone has the money to take their elderly parent out of the nursing home.
Yep.
And
or the
take
space
off
to
work.
Bring them home.
To take care of them. What are people doing in that situation? Anyway, so let's talk a little bit about, I didn't even really explain this, but SOCAP is a conference that's happening in 2 weeks. I didn't really explain that. I go every year. I love it. I love it because it is full of inspiring people doing inspiring things and experimenting with new ideas. And it also has a ton of social entrepreneurs. So one of the things that's like kind of a signature is it's like 100 social entrepreneurs that are able to come for free, right?
We do. This year we have 113.
And it's really cool. You're just like sitting on a bench, and there's, a woman from West Africa sitting next to me pitching her, eco soap brand where it's made, in a commune in whatever country, and supporting low-income women, to a Silicon Valley investor. Like it almost gives me chills, like that they have that ability, and more so this year because it's going to be open to more people because it's cheaper and it's on the internet, right?
Right, absolutely.
That's certainly the hope, the intention,
and that I think that's the opportunity with having to go virtual, is we get to open it up and open the conversation up to so many more people that would not be able to come to San Francisco to be a part of the event. They couldn't afford to fly here. So we're seeing a nice expansion of the type of people who are going to join us.
Yeah. And I should just do this. I should define what a social entrepreneur is, because a lot of people don't know. So social entrepreneur is an entrepreneur. They could be the head of a nonprofit. They could be a head of a for-profit, but their primary goal is social. Their reason to start whatever it is social. So it may make them tons of money. It may make $0, but the primary goal is social. So I worked with a ton of social entrepreneurs when I was at Ashoka, from women who were training illiterate women in political participation in Pakistan, to women who were, working on changing norms and laws to change genital mutilation in Africa, to Gary Barker, who's our guest next week, who's kind of like reformed this whole new concept of masculinity. So, actually, one entrepreneur that I found really inspiring last year is actually a Fletcher grad, and I had no idea what she was doing, but she's created an investment vehicle that um, makes sure that you're not investing in private prisons,
Mm.
Yeah.
which I think
That
is just a really interesting idea.
absolutely. Oh, go ahead, Kate. You're about to say
I
something.
was just going to say the amount of creativity and the innovation is extraordinary. It just is. And then the beauty of the big tent, as we lovingly call and refer to SOCAP, and now it's even bigger because it's online, is that there's this ability to cross-pollinate. And one of our key beliefs and values is the wisdom of the crowd. So working together and making those serendipitous connections, who knows what will happen as a result. So we're really particularly excited, as the example that you just cited, that we're going to be able to do that exponentially now.
Now, how has your framework, so no, one thing I want to talk about, sorry, I'm thinking about where to start. I would love it if you could actually define what impact investing is first, because that I didn't know what that was. I still am slightly confused. So can you walk us through what it means to be an impact investor, impact investing?
Sure. I think at the easiest place, impact investing are investments that are pursuing profit and a purpose at the same time. So they are investments that are going to enrich communities instead of just getting a return, and that they are taking those investments and putting them back into a broader range of community, environmental, social impacts, and trying to drive change through impact.
Yeah, there's a specific purpose change that they're trying to address and drive.
So one thing that worried me at SOCAP 1 was how I felt like the impact investing space was dominated by white Silicon Valley men who formerly worked in finance and then decided they want to try to do something good for the world. Is that changing at all?
Hugely. Yes. Well, not as fast as we'd like. Let's be honest. Let's be straight.
Yeah.
I think, it started on the heels of SOCAP itself started on the heels of the recession in 2008. And it was started by, yes, some definitely privileged white males who some were kind of more hippie-ish and some were definitely kind of hardcore investors who were trying to figure out, how can I leave behind a legacy? And these problems are really bad. Impact investing was actually created as a way and a method of addressing horrific social change that's needed at scale, because philanthropy alone wasn't enough. They're just the money wasn't there, but they also couldn't spread it fast enough. And so there was a meeting in 2007 where a group of very concerned high net worth individuals, some European banks, some investors, regular investors got together, and hence the term was coined. Fast forward 2008, SOCAP began. Over time, we've gotten more and more broader, especially as we bring in the social entrepreneurs. But as Carrie mentioned earlier, it's something that we are actively working to shift, because we're still not satisfied with what we're seeing, both in terms of not only just the attendance, but the allocation of the funds to these folks who so desperately need it and are doing the work in some of the key communities that normally are being left behind.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would say that while it's changing slightly, there is a lot of work that still needs to be done. The representation of the impact investing community, the financial community in general, is truly not representative of our actual society. And that, I think, is what needs to be changed. It is why, for the last 3 years, we have focused on racial equity, to be able to point out we need to change the systems, and we need to be able to change the systems so that we are providing a place and a space where diverse managers can actually be at the table allocating funds. And it's when they are allocating funds that are representative of their communities where we're actually going to start to see the change, and then it continues to trickle from there.
Right, because they actually know what's needed.
They know the solutions.
Tell the chicken story or the toilet story.
Oh, okay.
I love the toilet story.
Wait, true story. So one of the situations is that there's such a disconnect. There's a lot, historically, there's been a assumption about, a lot of what we often will call, the white people coming in and helping the brown people, et cetera. And so I happen to know of an organization that had sat down with some investors, and the investors very nicely patted them on their head and said, oh my gosh, we know what the problem is. It's sanitation. This is what your village issue is. So they went back and they shipped several hundred toilets. Fast forward, they come back to see how things are working and how the community's doing. They show up and look at that. There are the toilets, and inside the toilets is where everyone is storing their chickens.
I just love that.
Because they want to save their food. So they were really not that concerned about, sanitation at all. It was, I got to eat. There are just some really basic, and I think it's actually a really good parable for the reality that we're facing now. I mean, I think there's some just cruel realities that we haven't as a country, really as a world, looked at, some just basic requirements for life. But yes, that is a story that I think perfectly exemplifies what can happen and has been happening, and why oftentimes when people are hearing, oh, we're going to help you, they may be met with a little trepidation and perhaps some massive eye rolls.
Yeah. The other thing that I, have found really interesting is that at SOCAP and just in general in the impact investing space, there's all this talk about what is impact, what quantifies impact. But I rarely hear people talk about, what if we create harm? What if we don't create a good impact? And in the international development space, there's a do no harm kind of ethos where you have to go in and do a conflict analysis of a country to see, okay, what are the ethnic groups? Like, for example, if you give all the jobs to one ethnic group and not the other, and there's a history of ethnic grievances, you could start a civil war. So is anybody thinking like, hey, we could actually potentially not just not create impact and not make money, but actually do harm? Is anyone thinking that?
I think there's a greater realization. Go ahead, Care.
Oh, no. I think there is realization of that, but there are also entities that are very specifically trying to change the way funds are managed and deployed. And I think a really great example of this is the Boston Ujima Project, where they are community-centered and community-designed. The funds are truly dispersed from community members that are specifically looking at the very micro pieces of how the funds not only will be dispersed, but then the end impacts. And I think it's those end users that we're really starting to see more and more attention going to, and making sure that the impact is connected with that. And that's a lot of the impact management and measurement, or IMM, in the impact investing field, is really starting to look at what are all of those measures that we can assess. There is no standard measure currently, and that's part of the conversation that the entire field is looking into.
Yeah, I think everyone has to really do a better job at clearly defining, what is the difference? What's value? What's impact? What's profit? What's success? I think a lot of these have been based on what had been. And so now we kind of need to regroup and take a look at how that's shifted and what it should look like, especially as we start practicing and realizing that we need to go. It's not all about profit. It's not all about shareholder primacy. There's so many different populations that are impacted in amongst all of us. We cast a wide pool of ripples. And so looking at all the different stakeholders that are impacted.
Yeah, absolutely.
I was also going to say another place where a lot of this work is happening is within social impact bonds. So those are pretty complex vehicles that are used to look at an impact and then create various layers and partnerships, public-private partnerships that are addressing that impact. And so I think that's where we're really starting to see some of the interesting conversations around do no harm, and then how do you start to adjust even within a large scale project like that, when you are starting to see, oh, well, maybe this was an impact that we didn't expect to come out of this. And how can you move in different directions quickly so that you are addressing some of that harm that might show up. And that's happening around recidivism. There are some great ones that are showing up around human rights and refugee communities. So there's those types of very complex deals, I think, are starting to show some new paths forward.
Well, can you just, I actually still don't totally understand. What exactly is a social impact bond?
Sure. So a social impact bond is a measurement or a tool that is created amongst multiple players. And they are, you can have philanthropic dollars involved. You can have often government dollars that are involved, and they are creating let me give you an example. So in New York, they have a bond that they looked at for recidivism. And in order to create the investment vehicle, they said, how can we take a look and build in, similar to any type of municipal bond, but that's actually looking at impacting this recidivism rate. And so in order to do that, you have to create a pretty complex capital stack where you're including multiple types of capital, from private capital to municipal capital and then oftentimes you will have philanthropic capital that is helping to guarantee some of this initial funding until you start to see some of the return from the investments that are being placed.
So it's like mixed assets kind of all together.
Yes.
Yeah.
Interesting. The other trend that I find really interesting is now banks creating these ESG funds. So specifically, like, for an investor that comes and says, I want to do something good with my money, or I want to know that my money is not going into private prisons, or and I even maybe want to have a little bit of impact. So ESG stands for environmental, social, and governance. And so a lot of banks are now kind of pushing these funds. But something that I've seen is that environment, I think part of it is this environment is measurable. You can say like, oh, we let out 100 less emission points, or we cut down 100 less trees. And so a lot of firms are doing really well in terms of reducing their carbon footprint or their environmental kind of negative impact. But yet I feel like the social and governance pieces are kind of lagging. What's your thoughts on that?
I think social's harder. People have said that social is harder to measure and harder to get your arms around. Governance is, I think, as more and more people start looking to how companies are operating, how they're dealing with their CEO pay, how their shareholder, how they as an organization, and what their output is. So how are they treating their people? And then what are their products doing to the planet is impacting how people view them.
Yeah, I would say kind of building on top of that, the S of how are you treating your employees? And then the G of those management processes and practices around board governance. But one of the things that I was reminded of, I think just even yesterday, Tiffany McGee, she is the founder and CIO of Momentum. And she was saying that we are in the Super Bowl of ESG right now, and that what we're starting to see is that the S, so with Black Lives Matter, that the S, all of these companies came out, and everyone had a statement right away. Yeah. And so and that was around the S. And so she's saying we are starting to see the S affect the G now, for one of our first times in history, and that's really powerful, and that movement of the S affecting the G can have a lot of long-term effects going forward.
Let's talk about how California has pioneered board governance. So California was the first state, or I think, is it the only state? It might be, to mandate that there must be a woman on the board of any publicly traded company. And then they just came out with a new law that says there must be one person of color on every board of any publicly traded company. Do you have any insight into how that was able to come through in California?
Well, I know it was, interestingly enough, on the one hand, initially when it came out, everybody was hooray, hurrah, but then a lot of the businesses were very upset because they didn't like being told how they should be setting up their governance. And I think I think Gavin Newsom is extraordinary. And I think it was such a necessary move moving forward. I think, the first partner, Jennifer, probably also played quite a bit of a role in that, making people take a look at how are we setting up these businesses. But there's also been extraordinary research from Pew, from Catalyst, from PwC, all about the impact of having a female and several females, and even more so when there's greater diversity in terms of race, impacts a company in terms of its returns and its creativity and its stability. So I think that was a big piece of it as well.
Yeah, and innovation. I mean, if there was ever a time, like there was already studies to show that it increases innovation to have a more diverse, not just board, but workforce. If there was ever a time where we needed innovation, like I recreated my business like 6 times during COVID. Like I needed all the hands I could get of be like, okay, you used to do this, but this isn't going to work anymore. What do you do now?
There's actually a really interesting physiological reason why having women on a board actually empowers a company and makes it more stable. And that is, we all know how when we're looking for a job, it's a well-known fact, women will sit there and say, oh my gosh, I only have 8 out of 10 of these capabilities. So I better not go after the job. More often than not, it's been measured that men will do this. They'll say, okay, I've got 4 out of 6. Great, I'm going for it. So there's that sort of bon vivant, all right, risk-taking, into the pool go we. Well, that same caution and deep dive thinking that a woman expresses when she's looking at her job, that carries over into the boardroom when one is looking at, are there companies that we should be purchasing? Mergers and acquisitions? Are there new products we ought to be considering? And so it has been tracked that caution actually positively impacts the stability of a company, because more often than not, the hunches and the decisions to go, directions to go in are successful.
So the other thing that you've both talked about is kind of starting to think about racial equity. And I know, Carrie, this has been a big focus of your thinking and your work and re-envisioning SOCAP and just racial equity. Like, how has the Black Lives Matter movement and this thinking about racial equity influenced your work?
Absolutely. There are so many layers to it. I think not only the Black Lives Matter movement, a couple of things that have been really in my mind lately. I have been able to learn from a number of Black women in particular in the impact investment space, talking about we have to center racial equity. And when we truly center racial equity and think about every single piece of what we do, with a racial equity lens, that is when we start to make some really significant moves and changes. But that it takes and requires a lot of intentionality. And that is something that, frankly, we at SOCAP and SOCAP Global are starting to do more and more of. And it really has been as a part of the Black Lives Matter movement, but then also starting to look at our own unconscious bias individually and collectively as an organization, but also the fact that we are we're a company that's situated in the capital markets, and the capital markets are systemically biased and build systemic racism. And so if we're not looking at that, we are really missing some pieces. And so we are starting to take a deep dive, as Kate has said before, taking things down to the studs, but really examining and taking more of like an excavation eye of all of our policies and practices. Are there places where we're being extractive? And what does that mean? Where are the opportunities for us to build more and build inclusively, and really looking at our policies to say, do we have policies or do we have practices that are allowing for that? And then, of course, looking at our own teams and making sure that we are building a diverse team ourselves. And so it goes with a lot of learning. We are working with an advisor who is going to help us as a team think about, she calls it the 3 layers of head, heart, and hands. So really thinking, but then also doing. And that's where I think also SOCAP, as we start to look at our next 10 years as an industry of impact investing, but also just the impact economy, is what are we doing? We really need to start looking and doing with intent and action. And the more that we center racial equity in all of that, we will start to make more seismic shifts than, I believe, the incremental ones that could be seen as incremental over the last 10 years.
Go ahead, Kate.
I was just going to say, and then I would add, upon being successful with all of that, then we can actually do the true systemic, where we are just being equitable and equity plus. So a step beyond it, because there's been such a history of a lack of equity.
Can you dive into what equity plus is? Like, I think it's a really provocative, interesting idea.
Yeah. So equity plus is, forever, there's been groups who are have had significantly greater privilege than others. So that when we simply get to equity, we need to go beyond that to make sure that they actually have the opportunity to go beyond it as well, and to really thrive and soar, as opposed to just survive and exist.
I just keep thinking about, I was actually listening to a panel this morning on venture capital allocation, and how 2% of venture capital in the U.S. still goes to women. It will raise by like a 0.1, and then it goes back down. Very little goes to founders of color. I just keep thinking, what would the world look like if 50% of all VC dollars had to go to women, and there had to be equitable, a third had to be people of color, or half also had to be people. What would the world look like? Because there'd be so many businesses that were now headed by female and people of color founders. How cool would that be?
Well, and how powerful and how healthy it would be,
right?
As across every level. Pick a sector. Seriously, healthcare, climate, all of it would be not necessarily fixed by any means, but definitely healthier, collaborative, open. I think there's a certain humility that is practiced because of that collaborative nature. a lot of that women often display.
Mhm.
Yeah.
And that it is proven, as we were talking about before, that diverse teams do much better. So they, of course, are going to be able to create different, more durable solutions as well. The same thing happens in the capital markets. So it is proven that diverse managers are outperforming regular white-led right now. And I think that that is a really significant measure for us to take a look at. And why is that? We don't know necessarily the why, but it's because they are really looking at different solutions and being able to pinpoint those solutions.
Although you could also argue that because it's so hard for someone of color or a woman to get to that position, that you have to like outperform everyone, whereas it's so easy
Absolutely.
as a white man.
True.
Who, like, I just love the name of the book.
Absolutely.
Why do so many incompetent men become managers? And I was just having a conversation with a woman who worked at the UN today, and she was just telling me how it was like there was no women in senior management, or maybe one, and she kept trying to get promoted, and it was like, there's some reason that we can't move you up. So we're going to bring in this white European man because he's married to a Latina woman. And he's so experienced. And it's like, no matter how much she tried, she like couldn't get up that ladder. So yeah.
I think on that end, ways that other sort of, and going back to A26 and the bond the past you were talking about that was going on in California, I think some other ways of getting more women involved in senior leadership and also in board presence is to expand beyond your typical CFO, COO, kind of more quant-oriented titles. I believe that two of the most important leaders and leadership voices we're going to be hearing from in the future, one is a chief people officer or CHRO, because people are going to be our primary resource. And if you've got the right people, we all know teams make all the difference. And the other is the marketing. How do we share true narratives and the power of storytelling and bringing this impact to life? Mm-hmm. Both of these areas, whether we like it or not, they primarily, more often than not, happen to have more women in those roles. That's not to say that I don't want to see more women and girls getting involved in STEM, and so thereby more quant-oriented. I do. But the reality is right now, this would be an easy way if we started opening up and making room for those voices at the board table, we would get some quick influx of women.
The other role that I've started to see pop up that I think is really a sign of progress is chief impact officer. Or
I was just going to mention that.
Yeah.
Yep.
Because, historically, CSR, it's been like, okay, we can do whatever we want as a company. And then we're going to put corporate social responsibility over here. And we're going to do a few good things that make us look good. Whereas I think having a chief impact officer that's at the C-suite is threading impact throughout the company.
Well, and as Carrie says, I think it brings to life what she was just talking about, where we'll use racial equity as an example. You're looking at every single aspect, and through using that lens and that filter through every piece. How are we taking care of our employees? How are we taking care of our vendors? How are we taking care of our community, other broad-based partners? And I agree. I think that's going to be a really powerful shift.
Mm-hmm. And I think that it's also, it's a real growth area for the economy right now, but the impact economy in particular are corporations, and how are they really examining their impact beyond CSR, and then also ensuring that all of that is connected to your bottom line, and so that we are integrating all of that will become the way that we're able to see much larger shifts in impact overall as well.
One more thing we haven't talked about, ladies, is stakeholder capitalism.
Mm-hmm.
Can one of you explain what stakeholder capitalism is and how things are hopefully trending that way?
Sure. So 50 years ago, Milton Friedman wrote a famous letter on September 13th.
Good old Milton.
Good old Milton. In the New York Times. And it was all talking about how the purpose of a company is to drive return. It's all about the shareholder. Think of Gordon Gekko and the movie Greed, all of that. And that was your whole purpose. As a result of that, that's where a lot of companies started cutting corners at all costs to get as much profit as possible. Executive pay started getting out of whack because they were paid on the returns, and the whole system just was wrecked. So now stakeholder economy is essentially where a company is realizing, oh my gosh, I actually have to pay attention to the people, the planet, and yes, the profit, but how am I behaving also as a community member? How am I running my business? How am I paying all the different stakeholders? Again, your employees inside, your community, your vendors, your customers, your partners. Am I ensuring? How am I sourcing all of the resources that I'm using? And making sure that I am delivering against that ESG filter we mentioned earlier in a net positive fashion.
Mm-hmm. And I would add that it's also placing long-term sustainability at the center of things too, and really trying to look at risk differently, and deciding that it is a true risk to not be considering these long-term sustainability pieces.
How do you see that being able to shift? We have unbelievable inequity in the US with, I can't even remember what percentage of people holding most of the country's wealth. Do you see stakeholder capitalism as being able to shift that at all from the kind of the very rich 1%?
I believe over time, yes. And I think the reason why is younger generation, who are the next generation of wealth, and as more women, as the racial mix shifts within the world as well. I will also say that, they're going to be, the next generation is also voting much more loudly with their feet where they work, right? Is it a place that aligns with who I am? Yeah. I'm going to buy the products that I know are actually legitimately not harmful to the greater based planet, et cetera. And then I'm going to pay attention where I'm investing, right? So instead of maybe investing in a large bank, I'm going to invest maybe in a credit union or a community development arena where I can make sure that my dollars, when a bank takes the money and they loan it out, it's actually going to help support community programs that I care about that can really make the lives of those around me better.
I love this new platform called Republic, which is basically like seed companies, but they specifically have a focus on female-led companies, and they'll say like, this is a social impact driven company, but it's letting people kind of get in and be their own like little venture capitalists for startups, and give them the support that they really need to kind of, if you don't get seed funding as an entrepreneur, like, and you're not making revenue right away, like, it's really hard.
Very hard.
I think that's one of my biggest frustrations is, historically with VCs, there's this such impatience, and they come in because they're much historically more focused on talking about additive versus extractive. They're more focused on what's the return going to be. And you have 18 months. And if I don't see that hockey stick growth in 18 months, you're a risk, huge risk. I got to get out. Or I'm going to boot the CEO whose dream it actually was. So I believe that as we start shifting and getting more people on a broader base of startup dollars and other interesting ways and other interesting business models, like there's the stewardship model of companies, there's the ESOPs, there's like REI,
worker owned
opportunities. I think those are some really interesting new business model types that are definitely, we're going to start seeing more of. And I just hope that one day we won't be saying social entrepreneur. you'll say entrepreneur. And an entrepreneur, of
Will all
course,
have a social impact.
of course, because you will not be in business and you will have no customers, nor will you have employees if you're not.
Yeah. Any last words of wisdom that you would like to point out? I will say that SOCAP, the conference, is happening October 19th to 23rd over the internet, and it is
Over the internet.
about 1 million times cheaper than it usually is. It's actually affordable this year. And you know, I would encourage people to check it out. I've met so many wonderful, amazing contacts through it, and really inspiring social entrepreneurs. So, if there's anything else that you want to say about maybe something you're looking forward to coming up, that'd be awesome.
I would say that with SOCAP in mind, it's just the idea of being able to, even though we can't gather in a physical place, that we are still all together, being able to get into this amazing little screen and network and share ideas and discuss the power of change that this moment has, and how are we going to meet it, and how are we going to start to really design solutions that have the potential within the next couple of years, but certainly within the next 2 decades, to really change the course of history and I think the planet. So it's pretty exciting.
That just gives me chills. I just love the ambition. I love the dreaming big. It's great. Kate.
And I was just going to say, I just want to really urge everyone, believe. These are such kind of funky, crazy times, and it's unprecedented times. So I'm going to challenge everybody then to do an unprecedented act, because there's a very thin line between fear and excitement. And I think there's so much possibility. And now more than ever, we have this greater ability to come together and drive change, as Carrie just said. So I think just don't give up hope, believe, vote, for sure. Vote, please vote. And I hope you make it to SOCAP, because we'd love to have you join our merry little band that is getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And, together all ships rise, and we hope you'll come on board.
Thank you so much, ladies. I love the Joseph Campbell quote: "The cave you fear to enter holds the treasure that you seek." I always tell that if I'm working with clients or groups. It's like you have to get through that fear in order to really get to the other side, and then there's that treasure. It's kind of very alchemist. So I want to just thank you for being such wonderful women with wonderful, aspirational, empathetic, human-centered, caring visions for the future. And we need more people like you.
Well, thank you. And thank you for raising the voices of everybody, Samantha. That's a really important to amplify. And thank you for doing that for us.
Thank you. It was a pleasure. All right, everyone. I love having guests like that, of just imagining the future and just thinking about what's possible and how could we reimagine the system, and that things don't have to be like they always were. And I think the worst thing that could happen from COVID is that we go back, like Kate said, to normal. And the best thing would be is that we create a new normal that's like 1 million times better than what normal was, and is much more equitable for all sorts of people that were oppressed and excluded from the old normal. So again, thanks to Carrie and Kate. I put the website for Social Capital, for SOCAP, in the chat. It's www.socialcapitalmarkets.net. I'm going to be attending SOCAP and also moderating a panel of next generation change makers. I also want to thank Stream Inspectors for generously sponsoring the show and creating all of the beautiful floating things behind me that you see moving around, because I definitely am not capable of that. Next week, we're going to be bringing in Gary Barker. He's one of the world's leading experts on masculinity. We're going to dive deeper into the kidnapping plot and also how he's working around the world to redefine masculinity and caretaking for men. I also want to invite the Rising Star women here. I am actually hosting a Women's Leadership Challenge, which is an 8-week course that has a community aspect to it. It's full of aspirational, global, world women leaders, and we're basically redefining new styles of leadership together through a peer-to-peer learning model. There's great speakers. I'm incredibly excited to see the magic that happens when women from different industries and ages and races and nationalities come together to, just like we were just doing here, to really imagine the future, but over a systemic 8-week course where we also talk about dismantling these systems of oppression. So I'm just going to type that in the chat box. It's www.empowerglobal.net/news/online-challenge. So I would encourage you to apply because I'm now taking applicants for the next cohort. I think that should go over in a second. And I'm also going to reiterate what Kate and Carrie said. Vote. Please vote. I am literally begging you to vote. I will hold your hand to go help you vote. Like, I will deliver your ballot. This election, there is so much that is resting in this election. And a lot of states, you're also at the point where you may not be able to register anymore. It may be the cutoff date, or it may be the cutoff date to request your absentee ballot. So if you need an absentee ballot, you want to go to the county where you register to vote, to their Board of Elections website, and you should be able to request an absentee ballot. If you don't get it, call them on the telephone. Yes, there's something called the telephone that some people still use, and most counties still use the telephone to communicate. There's no texting. They don't check their emails. Call them and say, hey, I don't have my ballot. Where is it? Can you please check it in the system? Other thing you can do is volunteer to be a poll worker. A lot of places you have to actually be registered in the county or that state in order to be a poll worker, but we're having a crisis with poll workers right now because a lot of elderly people used to be poll workers and it's too risky for them because of COVID. I also want to encourage you, look for ways that you can help out coming up to the election, whether you're a Democrat or a Republican. Supermajority.com has a lot of great resources for volunteering, for phone banking. You know, they try to create a community feeling where you're actually phone banking with other people while you're on Zoom. It's actually fun and you get to talk to people from across the country. So I'd also encourage you to see how you can help. Don't let this election be the last one where you say to yourself, oh, I wish I could have done something. I wish I'd volunteered. Please don't do that. There's too much on the line. Climate change, democracy, racial equity, global relations with other countries, women's rights, the right to an abortion. I could literally go on and on of what's at stake for this election. I've never seen this much at stake. So vote, volunteer, convince your friends to vote, post political stuff on Facebook, even if you get annoying comments. So that's all for my voting rant today, but it's just really so important. The other thing you can do is that sometimes there's going to be things about amendments on a ballot that you might not know what they are. So it might be like, you know, do you support something, something, something? So again, if you go to your, like the Democrats or Republican website in your district, they're going to have what's called a sample ballot where it shows like the answers that they would recommend to each of those questions. And also they'll show you like who they recommend for the down ballot option. So if you get the ballot and you're like, okay, I know who I want to choose for president and vice president, but I have no idea who all these people are that are running for the school board, your Democratic or Republican office will have their recommendations of who to pick. So I want to thank you for joining me today. I love, I love being able to talk to everyone. And until next week, this is Samantha Carlin signing off. Thanks. Bye-bye.